Hello, everybody. My name is Tyler Friedman. I'm the Associate Curator of Contemporary Art at the Museum of Wisconsin Art. I'd like to thank the Wisconsin Humanities Council for supporting this event and other programs for Wisconsin Funnies, which will close at MOWA on January 3rd. I'd also like to thank the National Endowment for the Arts, the Wisconsin Department of Tourism, Pick Heaters, and the James and Karen Hyde Foundation. Thank you so much for being here for this talk with Pete Poplaski. Pete was born in Green Bay and was an early and enduring presence on Milwaukee's underground comic scene of the 1970s. As the art director for Dennis Kitchen's Kitchen Sink Press, Pete designed, drew, and inked some of the most interesting and impressive works to emerge from the venerable homespun publishing house located on a farm in Princeton, Wisconsin. His work appeared in the pages of corporate crime comics, consumer comics, Quagmire, and more recently, he designed and drew the fantastic cover image for the Wisconsin Funnies exhibition and catalog. As we'll discuss shortly and for the next 40 minutes or so, Pete is a real student of popular culture, and his work is characterized by a deep knowledge of the American comics tradition, as well as Western art history more broadly, an exacting eye for detail, especially in capturing the style of other artists, and a scholarly zeal for investigating and understanding the and other cultural fixations. So the way that I imagine this going, Pete and I are going to talk for about 40 minutes, and then we'll leave the final 20 to 25 minutes for a Q&A. I encourage everyone to put comments in the comment section as we go, but as I'll probably wait till 8:40 or 7:40 or 40 minutes from now, wherever you are, until we get into the Q&A. So without further ado, Pete, the question I guess that should be asked at the end of a year like 2020 is, how are you? How have you been weathering COVID?
Well, I've just kind of been a prisoner of my sister's basement in Green Bay, and they managed to push aside a lot of their personal items to make way for like a cot and a little desk and a table with a light and stuff. And so I have a lot of my stuff in Green Bay in boxes, which I have to go and kind of pick one here and one there to do research that I'm working on. I'm working on a Zorro book project. I'm working on commissioned comic book covers and things for like Superman and Batman, or the Legion of Superhero in one case, where I have to draw 20 characters on one cover. And then I also went out and worked on some paintings, and I have a little painting I can show you later, which shows you my fine art as opposed to my cartoon work and stuff, because it's good to have a little bit of a diverse ability. I'm not a guy that has painted himself in the corner, so to speak. I'm like all over the place, as Tyler knows.
Very true, yeah. The works in your house were almost all large oil paintings in a more classical style.
Right.
And that shows, I think that shows in the comic work of yours that I've seen. There's you have a sort of chameleon protean quality where I mentioned corporate crime comics, that you drew that cover in the style of Chester Gould and Dick Tracy. Other stuff, I know that the cover for the Wisconsin Funnies catalog, for instance, you adopted a lot of different stylistic elements from other underground cartoonists who were your friends.
Sure. The thing is, one of the things about growing up and being a baby boomer is that for me, first of all, as a kid, and I was born in 1951, my heroes were like George Reeves as Superman on television. He's a real guy. Clayton Moore as the Lone Ranger, that's a real guy. Guy Williams as Zorro, that's a real guy. And my childhood inclination was to pretend I'm one of these adventure characters, and I'd wear a towel for a cape, or I wear a black mask and play Zorro. But then I was kind of hooked by animated cartoons, and in those days, the ones that attracted me were like Mighty Mouse, because he was a lot like Superman and had powers and was flying around. But then there was also a character on Captain Kangaroo early in the morning called Tom Terrific, and he had a sidekick that was a dog, Mighty Manfred. And I immediately thought that these look like fun to draw kind of characters. They were very simple, and of course on black and white television, they're outlines. So I started thinking about outlines because Superman was real on television, but then my aunt gave me a coloring book, and here is Superman drawn with outlines. And then comic books followed. And I just found the idea of outlines a real hook to getting me into a state where I would want to draw. And then I taught myself how to copy all these different characters. And I'd include not just superheroes, because I would draw Mickey Mouse or Woody Woodpecker. And then when the Flintstones came on TV, I think in 1959, I taught myself how to draw all those Hanna-Barbera characters. So whatever was sort of fun, but I always returned to action figures because they were, again, Batman was a mysterious, almost scary character. And so I would get a comic book, and here's a beat up one. And this is an old Batman comic from about 1961. And I would read it, but I would read it for action. And then I usually would pick out Batman hitting a criminal or Batman on his bat rope. And then I would make a tracing. I'd take it to the window. Here you go. See, there's Batman hitting a guy on a big statue. But anyway, I would take that and trace it, and I've made a facsimile right here. And so I would very carefully outline it and then get a ballpoint pen and outline it even more. And so that was the technique. It was take a window, trace an image, and then ink it with a ballpoint pen. I did not know about India ink and things like that till later. But that's how I developed my eye and my skill, because after I would, if I drew it from just looking at it, like I drew a lot of Popeye, and Popeye's got a real tricky kind of head, and it's, you know, made with circles and stuff, right?
Yeah.
And I do have a postcard where I was trying to draw Popeye's head from memory. And so it's a little bit more Picasso-like. But I would work on any of these characters that I had a comic book of just as practice.
You had mentioned to me once, I think you said you would start off by tracing the character, and then you would try to draw that drawing by looking at the drawing. And then once you could do that, you would try to just draw it from memory to ensure that you had really assimilated that. Yeah,
the important thing is that, you know, I had this perfectionist inclination. And I'm a Virgo, so Dennis Kitchen is a perfectionist. I'm a perfectionist, and my pal Robert Crumb is a perfectionist because he's also Virgo. So we have this Virgo fellowship where we try to be perfect. And that has always been something that I had to, you know, work with in order to progress to another level of ability. Because one of the things about being an artist is for some people, they want to express themselves. Other people, it's a focus on skill. And, you know, there's all kinds of different forms of art, whether you're a painter, a sculptor, a printmaker, or a weaver, or anything, but there's a tremendous amount of skill that you have to learn so you can develop your work in the strongest direction that you can.
Speaking of the way that you taught yourself to draw based on the tracing method, essentially, you've turned this knowledge into something to help other people learn how to draw it. So maybe we can pull up on the screen this Superman drawing thing. This was sent as a handout to FOA members, Friends of Wisconsin Art, and this is derived from a coloring book that Pete has been working on, which we'll talk about shortly. And Pete, you just want to talk about how this handout works, what this is intended to do?
Well, see, this is an actual duplicate of a rough sketch I was doing for a Superman book cover. Publishing house IDW have been reprinting Superman comic strips, the dailies and the Sunday newspaper strips, which have never been before been republished. And so my job was to create covers. And so I would read the stories and come up with the strongest images. Now, this is a Sunday's book. And so I would have to read the story, and Superman is fighting aliens for one of the earliest times in the comic strip. And of course, this is from the 50s, and it's the story. I call the story in this Bug-Eyed Monsters, but Superman's fighting these 4 different weird alien creatures that will take over the Earth for this other planet. And it's drawn by the classic Superman artist Wayne Boring. And so this is what a Sunday page looks like. Anyway, I did a whole bunch of sketches of the figure for a cover that was supposed to have Superman catching Nazi bombs that were going to blow up an airplane factory. And so I did this sort of sketch, and then I looked at it and I thought, I could use this in this coloring book, that kids could make a game out of this. And so the trick is to make a photocopy of the page, take it to a window, and then trace out the Superman character by someone giving you numbers for hands and feet and the head position and the cape and things like that.
Yeah, so can we zoom in a little bit on the Superman drawing so we can see some of the numbers?
So this is traced from that. These are some different figures. And so I did these in colored pencil just so you know that it's a different figure.
Excellent.
So it's sort of a game. If somebody sits down and gives you 8 numbers and you trace this, you come up with a figure, and then you give them 7 numbers and they make a different figure. And so technically, if there's 22 body parts and you can multiply that by 22, that's how many figures you can make that are different.
It's a lot.
So you can spend a lot of time just learning to draw
mastering Superman
particular sequence
in the Wayne Boring style. Yeah.
In the Wayne Boring style, yeah.
Yeah. So your first step was you're autodidactic. You taught yourself to draw by tracing and memorizing and all of that. But we've talked about this before. When you were fairly young, Green Bay was declared culturally deprived and received some support from Lyndon Johnson's Great Society domestic agenda. Can you talk a little bit about that and how it affected your life?
Well, I was in high school at that time, and I was basically working from comic strips, and with another friend, I was doing stop motion animated dinosaur movies in my parents' basement. And so that ties up your time pretty much, because those are both very complicated things on top of going to high school. But I went to the high school teacher and said, I'd really like to learn how to oil paint. And so she said, well, there's this thing opening up called Operation Area Arts, and it's supposed to be college level instruction for high school people, and it's free. So I went, and I thought this is great because they had a painting studio, they had an etching studio, they had a crafts section, and then they also had a design course on Saturday morning. So I went every day, and so the teachers thought this was hilarious, and they eventually gave me my own key, and I could go there and work when there was no one else around. So I did that for a while, but eventually they moved the building to another location, and so I didn't quite have that freedom. But I was learning painting, and as one of the star pupils, I would have 2 professors sitting there asking me why I painted a painting the way I did. They'd ask me, we have discussions about, for instance, color temperature. Why do you have a blue there, and why are you putting it next to a red or an orange or something? And I would have to talk about the direction of the light. I'd have to talk about whether it was a cool or warm tone, and we'd have discussions about that. And so it put me on my toes, and it was fun. So, one of the things that I developed since I was one of the better art students was to try to help other people. And helping other people means that you don't really develop your ego where you think I'm the greatest and I'm going to the top of the class or whatever. So I've never really worked that way. And the thing is, that meant that when I went from comics into studying fine art, I had a strong backing in fine art as well. And then when I turned around and worked in comics, that meant a lot of the great comic book masters who just considered themselves professionals and craftsmen more than artists who, expressed themselves. And to work with me, because I thought they were great, it was fun because they admired my skills as a painter. And of course, I thought they were great as cartoonists and storytellers.
Yeah. I want to talk about that pretty soon, the lessons that you learned from the luminaries of the comics tradition. But all those opportunities came about via Dennis Kitchen and your association with Kitchen Sink Press. So when was it that you first met Dennis, and how did that relationship develop and turn into a profession?
Well, I first got in contact with him around April of 1970, and he had a housemate, because he was out of college, but he was still renting an apartment, and so his roommate was selling textbooks all across the state, and he came to Green Bay, and he happened to pick the student newspaper, which had cartoons by me in it. And he showed them to Dennis, and Dennis then immediately contacted me and said, "Do you know anything about underground comics and all this stuff?" And of course, I knew everything about underground comics, although I didn't know about Milwaukee underground comics. But I knew who R. Crumb was, and everybody in San Francisco, and Bijou Funnies, and in Chicago, all that. So he invited me down, and I went, and we, talked about, myself and some friends putting together our own comic book, and we decided to put one together. And initially, we had a group. Our film group was called Carp Productions, and we were going to call it All Carp Comics as a joke, which was just a local Green Bay joke. But for a wider audience, we changed it to Quagmire Comics, simply because we didn't really know what we were doing. And in those days, underground comics sold pretty well, and Dennis thought he could sell 10,000 copies of anything, so he published Quagmire Comics. But unfortunately, he had friends that pulled their backing away, and so the comic book, I always say, it bankrupted him. It might not have, but it contributed to it, and he had to start his business over. But he didn't hold that against me, and in fact, when he started Krupp Comic Works just a little bit later, he of course invited me down to work in a studio situation, and that one thing leads to another.
Yeah. And that led to crossing paths with people like Harvey Kurtzman of Mad Comics, then Mad Magazine fame, Will Eisner of The Spirit. So who were the most meaningful people who you learned from in those years, and what type of things did you learn from these people? Well,
as soon as I moved to Milwaukee, and I was still literally, I was sleeping on Dennis Kitchen's couch in his studio. And he got a thing from Will Eisner in the mail, and it's a cover for Snarf Comics with The Spirit. And he says, "So Pete, would you want to color The Spirit?" And I went, "What?" I couldn't believe it. So then I took all the Spirit comics. The Spirit had been published by Harvey Comics. And I went and I took a magnifying glass and I studied all the dot patterns that create all the different colors. And so then when it came down to do what they used to call manual color overlays, that means you do an overlay for each color. Blue is one, red is one, yellow is one. I kind of had to figure out what dots made what color, and so I did it, and everybody liked it, and then I started doing coloring for other artists who didn't know the technique, and I just tried to get, as professional as I could with it. So that was the beginning with Will Eisner. So I was impressed when I met him, and he saw that I was a painter, and so we got along great because he was always trying to, have a stronger look in bookstores. And so I would go to bookstores and put magazines out and look at how they competed for logo and design and color. I would go and look at hardcover books and kind of line it up and see what it worked. And then I'd go back and we discussed it. And he never heard of anybody doing this before. But I just thought, if I'm going to learn anything about design and layout, you just kind of fall into it. My technique for laying out some of the book projects, like the Archetype coffee table handbook and things like that, is it was like a storyboard for a book or a magazine, but you threw everything on the floor so you could read it and move the pages around and then get a whole sense of movement from that. And I later found out that a Russian who got the job to design Vogue magazine in 1952 changed the whole design of magazine layouts because that's what he did. He threw everything on the floor. So I thought, well, there's something instinctive about this kind of play with any kind of mechanical design. So it was fun to learn that. And it was fun to work on Eisner stuff. And with Harvey Kurtzman, I was honored to ink a cover design that he did. And it was called For Kings in Disguise. And so I had to study all his early Mad Magazine comics and his EC comics that he drew and inked by himself, because he had a very personal drawing style that was very strong. And so I wanted to make sure that the strength of his drawing was, as the best it could be. And so, he appreciated that kind of effort into just working on a comic book cover with him.
Did you talk shop with these guys? Did Will Eisner use Winsor Newton Series 7 number 4 versus number 2?
Yeah. No, it's they all developed their own personal styles, but they all used Winsor Newton Series 7 number 3, and
number 3.
And they used different kinds of crow quill pen. Some Eisner used a really fine and hard pen nib, and there are other pen nibs that are very flexible. And Harvey's drawing style, when he inks it with his kind of pen nib, has this real like a whip through it and stuff. And that's the way when he would watercolor, do color roughs for covers and things like that, his watercolor brushstrokes had this snap to it. And I studied that very close, and I wanted to kind of carry that through to the final product. So it worked in some cases pretty well. And again, it was an honor. And then linking up with the Chicago people like Jay Lynch and Skip Williamson, who are totally different, wacky, anarchist kind of cartoonists, that was fun. And then when we had the studio first started, then people like Kim Deitch came and stayed for a few days, and Justin Green would come and stay a few days, and artists would come and check out the studio situation and hand in work and get money, and we had everything going up and up. And then the thing about underground comics is you had the Supreme Court passed a ruling that local cities could determine their own obscenity laws. And so that's what shut down all the underground comics and all the head shops and things.
Yeah, and it was right about that time that Dennis hooked up with Stan Lee and Comics Book, the short-lived Marvel-published quasi-underground piece came out, for which you did the first cover illustration.
Yeah, well, again, I was in the office, and he worked this up, and he went up to New York, and he talked to Stan Lee and came back, and so he, wanted me to do the cover. He had Don Glassford, who was one of the early Krupp comic work guys that dropped out. He did the logo for that, but then I came up with this goofy idea with crowds that are kind of glum and mad, angry looking almost, or disgusted. But the one guy laughing in the middle of the cover is reading Comics International, which was the cover, the comics before Comics Book. And somewhere along the line, Jim Warren, who did Creepy and Eerie magazines, heard about this title that Marvel was going to do called Comics International. He threw one together with a Richard Corbin cover and went to lunch with Stan Lee and said, "Oh, I got to show you my latest project." And Stan Lee, like, "What? Yeah, that's our title. That's what we're working on." So they changed everything to just Comics Book. And I had to redo the cover. And Dennis wanted this idea of like this, knife, going into the drawing board. And I did a parody of what the Marvel superhero characters and the Marvel monsters were like, because having grown up with Marvel Comics, they started out as monsters and evolved into superheroes with problems. And I had a monster, but I had a Human Torch kind of figure with a cigar, like Sergeant Fury and his Howling Commandos. But the joke is they erased the cigar because they thought it was a hippie joint, like a drug reference. It wasn't. It was Sergeant Fury, their own character. Anyway, they monkeyed with the cover, but it came out, and there's always a different story with distribution, and you can put out a great magazine with it, but people don't know what it is and they never open a box and return it unsold. You're not going to do too many issues. So Comics Book lasted 3 issues, and then Dennis published the last 2 with the Kitchen Sink Press logo on it. But it was funny because Stan Lee would call up and ask for Dennis, and I'd say, "Oh, Dennis just went to the post office." But he'd call me. Sometimes he'd remember my name was Pete, and sometimes he'd call me Steve. And I'd say, "Well, Steve's not here. I'm Pete. What can I do for you, Stan?" And later on, I would meet him at comics conventions in either an elevator or during breakfast at hotels in Chicago, and we'd kind of chuckle because I'd say, "I remember me. We worked on Comics Book together," and he thought it was funny.
You mentioned that cocktail hour at the comic convention were the best time to schmooze.
Well, I mean, that was, again, I was hanging out with my brother and Mark Grunwald, who was working at Marvel Comics and writing a lot of stories about The Thing, and later on he did more Captain America stories that Stan Lee wrote. Anyway, he was working his way up as an editor, and he was friends with Dean Mullaney, and Dean Mullaney is the editor, on this book. So, all these connections, it's good to make friends in comics because you never know where somebody's going to have a project and say, "Well, would you like to do all the covers?" And they just give me total freedom because they trust me because of my years with Dennis on other projects and working with all the great guys that I have. But anyway, the joke about this was it was a Phil Suling cocktail hour at one of his conventions in the summer of 1980. And everybody goes to this, but one guy that never did, because he wasn't interested in hanging out or fans, was Frank Frazetta, the painter and illustrator of Conan the Barbarian paperbacks and also Tarzan. So we knew Frank Frazetta never went to these things. And so me, Mark Grunwald, my brother, and Dean Mullaney line up, and we go to the lady who's got the checklist, and I go and say, "Frank Frazetta," and she checks it off and says, "Thank you, Mr. Frazetta," and I walk in. And then Mark Grunwald comes up and says, Frank Frazetta. And she says, well, we seem to have a problem here. Somebody just walked in as Frank Frazetta. And then my brother would push him and said, no, I'm Frank Frazetta. And then Dean Mullaney says, they're all liars. I'm Frank Frazetta. And then meanwhile, Phil Sooling's girlfriend, who knew me, saw what we were doing and got the joke, and then just let them all in. So we all got in, and I walk in and I see Wally Wood on one side, and I see Bob Kane on the other side. So I thought, start with the oldest first. So I ran over and introduced myself to Bob Kane, creator of Batman. And I said, I've been reading Batman and buying all your comics, and I learned to draw from them. And I just wanted to say thank you. And so he said, well, it's always good to hear that. And good luck, everything like that. And then I turned around and you go over to Wally Wood, and Wally Wood says, what do you want to be a cartoonist for? It's a terrible life. And so anyway, you get, two different little action reaction kind of thing. But it's always fun to meet the guy behind the pen and brush.
Yeah. Let's talk Zorro. So we titled this talk From Aquaman to Zorro, which was an elaboration of From A to Z, indicating that we talk about everything. We haven't really talked about Aquaman.
I pulled out this early Aquaman comic from 19.
Yeah, you got it ready. But Zorro is really the one for you. So let's talk about your fascination with Zorro. Why do you regard Zorro as the archetype for the contemporary superhero?
Well, the thing is that in 1987, I went to a Christmas party, and it was the art crowd. But I noticed that my friends' children were watching the Disney Channel, and it was an episode of Zorro. And so I was curious, so I watched the episode with the kids, and then I went back and refilled my drink, and I thought, that's better than I remembered it. Who did it? Why is it still good? And because I had a lot of my Zorro toys and comics and stuff in my files, but it wasn't anything that I actually thought of as art or something that, even outside of the fact that a great draftsman like Alex Toth drew the Disney Zorro comics, it didn't really have any momentum for me. So then I started, videotaping the TV show, and I'm studying the story arcs and the stunts and stuff like that, because they had Yakima Canutt, the great stunt guy, on the first 13 episodes. And I thought, well, this is pretty good. Maybe how come nobody talks about this? Let's do a book. Well, Disney, you got to work with Disney, and Disney's always about, you got to pay a lot of money in advance. You can only sell what you're making for a couple of years if you're lucky, and then you got to destroy anything that's left over. So Dennis does not like to do that, and they had a run with a tin sign during the Rocketeer movie that Disney produced, and he just didn't want to deal with having any business to do with Disney. Anyway, I kept saying, come on, look at Douglas Fairbanks made money, Walt Disney made money, 20th Century Fox made money. Everybody makes money with Zorro. It's on in Europe. Everybody loves it. There's 43 movies. Come on, somebody's got to be making money. Let's do a book. Well, he didn't want to do it. But I got in connections with other people, because when we'd go to comic conventions, I was the guy asking for Zorro stuff. Suddenly everybody says, oh, I'm the Zorro expert. Oh, you want to know about Zorro? Call Pete Poplaski. So I get calls from California suddenly saying, do you have this episode? Blah, blah, blah. I'm doing a book. I interviewed, the stunt people and the makeup people and stuff. And after that, I thought, well, if this guy is got all these interviews already, he's on the case. So Dennis doesn't want to do this, but maybe I can work on this guy on designing the book, and he can get another publisher. So I had a big file of Zorro stuff by that time. And so I helped him, and McFarlane published his book, and his name is Jerry Dooley, and he did the unauthorized Zorro TV guide. But so I said, what's left with Zorro? Well, there was all the pulp magazines. So I went after the pulp magazines, and at one point I was one of 3 guys with all the Zorro stories. And it was leading up to doing a 3 hardcover volume of a facsimile edition thing, which not only had all the stories in their original form, but also how they interdiced with movies. Because as you know, if you have a popular character, you know, it's sold to the movies, then that's where toys and things spin off, and that's where the real money is. So, so I was working on that for a long time. But because I also live in Europe half the time, a guy in Florida who was missing stories was begging for help. And so some friends of mine said, "You're never going to finish it. So, you know, why don't you help him?" So I did, because I still have a bigger book in mind. You know, so I'm still working on a big coffee table art book about Zorro, and I have like 243 posters in all languages, and I have all the pulp stories, and yeah, and the thing is, over the years, the reason why I focused on Zorro and backtracked it is because I've come to the conclusion that Douglas Fairbanks Sr., who did the first Zorro movie in 1920 and created the swashbuckler, pirate, sword fighting, Avenger kind of character, that's where the superhero concept comes from, because all the kids that saw Douglas Fairbanks when they were in their late teens and stuff created Superman and Batman. And they all admit it. They said, this is Douglas Fairbanks. And yeah, we might use Clark Kent, might be Harold Lloyd, but they were basing their early ideas on silent movies, because silent movies were global. I mean, I just came across the first Zorro animated cartoon, and it's in Russia in 1927. I mean, you know, when Fairbanks was going to do a sequel called Don Q's Son of Zorro, most of the Hollywood leading men did a Masked Avenger costume picture. Tom Mix, a cowboy, did masked Dick Turpin. You had Rudolph Valentino played the Masked Eagle. You had a friend of his by the name of Richard Talmadge, who updated the Zorro character into modern day, and he played a character called the Black X, you know. But they all seem to be, it was a tribute to Douglas Fairbanks. And so he's, you know, that Fairbanks element is in all the Zorro movies. It's hard to get away from it. And that's where the billion-dollar industry is tied into the early silent movie industry, which, again, it went global. And Douglas Fairbanks with Charlie Chaplin, Mary Pickford, and D.W. Griffith in 1920 were the top dogs of Hollywood.
Mm-hmm. And there were also some conceptual similarities between Zorro and later superheroes that you've mentioned to me in the past. There's of course, just the masked identity thing. And then also the fact that the alter ego is kind of a milquetoast. You have Clark Kent, the bespectacled reporter.
Well, the thing is, a lot of people think, well, you know, it's a combination of Joaquin Murrieta, which is a real California bandito kind of character, and the Scarlet Pimpernell. And I've read everything on all these characters. And of course, the Scarlet Pimpernel is a classic, but it's mostly a women's story. It's focused on women and their family and getting these women out of France. And then this mysterious character appeared. And a lot of times the Scarlet Pimpernel does not wear a mask. He is a shapeshifter. He wears a disguise. One of his disguises is he plays an old, ugly woman carrying plague victims out of Paris. So he's in drag. And then he plays other ethnic characters, in other, at the ending. So he usually appears at the beginning or the end. And there's a lot of Scarlet Pimpernel adventure stories, actually. So I've read like 4 or 5 of them. And then there's the Joaquin Murrieta stories, which is, again, he's a nice guy who gets it's like Dances with Wolves. Every white guy in that movie is a jerk right from the beginning. And Kevin Costner, you know, he gets adopted by the Indians because he's the only good guy. And so that's the way Joaquin is. He's out for revenge, and him and Jack Three Fingers basically are cutting the throats of every German and Chinese and anybody else who's got gold and is in their way, because, you know, these jerks basically hung his brother and violated his wife and left him for dead. And of course, he comes back for revenge.
Yeah.
So,
so this Zorro fascination is going to culminate theoretically in this museum that's underway, and also this comic or the coloring book project that you've been working on. So maybe that can be the last question that I'll pose, and then we can open it up to questions.
Everything ties together because I kind of work on and off like a autobiographical kind of thing. I've done different Zorro projects, like I've done a Zorro cover for that Zorro book collection, and it's a self-portrait of myself in a Zorro costume. There's a series of 4 audio book cassette tapes collected by the Naxos Audio Book Company, and my paintings of myself as Zorro are the covers for this audio book set. And I did these years ago with the idea that if I dress up as Zorro, I won't have to pay Disney to use a Guy Williams photo. So, you know, and it's sort of fun then to have art exhibitions where you have, you know, landscape, still lifes, figure paintings, but then you have this Zorro section. And I realized I had to go this route because in 2002, February, Robert Crumb and I were guest speakers at the Prince's Foundation in London. And they had, because a friend of ours, Robert McNabb, had done a BBC art documentary about underground cartoonists and artists and on Crumb. So he did a whole thing about how horrible it was to be, you know, in a BBC art documentary. So it was pretty funny. And then they asked me to talk about the importance, how I thought BBC art documentaries are the greatest, because they gave you a lot of great information and in a way that a lot of people weren't making it. They weren't doing those kind of documentaries like the BBC. And they introduced me, and of course, nobody knows who Pete Poplaski is in London in 2002. I said, but if I do this, you'll know who I am. And I turned around and I put on the Zorro outfit and whipped around, and I said, I am, you know who Zorro is, you know, and he's an imaginary character, but he stands for truth and justice, and he never tells a lie. And I'm not going to lie to you. And so I give them this whole history, a story about Zorro and Douglas Fairbanks, and the idea of what I call cultural conditioning. And this is what this coloring book that I made for the Chillicothe Historical Museum. Chillicothe is a small Italian town, about 6,000 people, 18 miles north of Peoria, Illinois. And that is where the creator of Zorro, Johnston McCulley, grew up as a boy, and he was raised by his grandparents. Anyway, they had started digging into doing something about Zorro. I was doing information, and the problem with Chillicothe is it's an Indian name that means place of the chief, but there are 5 Chillicothe's because it's a, you know, the chief was all over the Midwest. Anyway, so there's a Chillicothe in Iowa and in Missouri and in Ohio, and it was actually the state capital for a while, in Illinois and Texas. Anyway, the most famous one is probably Missouri. Chillicothe, Missouri is the home of the machine that sliced bread in 1927. Zorro is coming up a little bit now because of superheroes. And like I said, Chillicothe in Ohio was a state capital for a while. But they had no idea of the real background. And so they had some information. I had more than they did, but I had all the posters and the toys and the things, and I had duplicates on a lot of things. So I said, look, let's get together. You do your research. I'll try to complement it with what I can find, and then I'll help give you or loan you the duplicates from my collection, and you'll have an international show. So that's what we did. And they even had some people from the Smithsonian come out and look at it. and I'm trying to develop it more. But the virus right now shuts everybody down.
Yes,
But
it does.
that's how that became. And so, because there's no TV show or movie of Zorro right now, you got to give handouts. You got to have kids interested in this. Because the thing about superheroes, when I grew up, the important thing about being the hero is you want to be a good guy. I want to be a good guy. That's the whole point of my fascination with Superman, the Lone Ranger, and Zorro. That's what television was telling you. These guys had ethics. Nowadays, it's more like, oh, it's tough to be a hero. The Hulk, he's got problems. Oh, Batman, he's got problems. But in the old days, the heroes, knew they were there for a reason and there to help people. That's what Superman used to say. And even in 1942, when Superman went to Congress about World War, he said, he's going to help fight on the home front and stop saboteurs and stuff until kindness and humanity is restored. It's not about truth, just the American way, kindness and humanity. So, what the hero stood for and the ethics is very important. And a lot of times with this coloring book, I've discovered that so many characters were actually created by Illinois people or drawn in Illinois, that characters like Mighty Mouse or Tom Terrific and Popeye, their code of ethics is in their theme songs. So the theme song in the old days, especially for kids, because why? The superhero was a vitamin for kids to take to basically say, be a good guy, not a bad guy.
I love it. I'm going to stop you right there, Pete, so that we can get to some of these questions or this comment section is going to explode, but we've gotten some good stuff turning. We'll start with Dennis Kitchen, who wonders, is it true that a couple of weeks ago, 2 of your originals sold at Heritage Auction for about $8,000 each?
Well, this was a work of art that I did in 1991. And I was going through some of my stuff in storage, and I always liked that Rancor monster from Star Wars that came out in like 1983. And I thought, why doesn't Marvel do a TV show that has 3 levels of animation? There'd be a Jack Kirby story made in stop motion. They would have a monster story like a Don Heck story with a man in a costume. And then the third would be like a 3-minute Steve Ditko vignette drawn in Ditko style. And I thought I could imagine, this comic book rack spinning, and then it would stop at Tales to Astonish. And you'd get these 3 animation stories. And I thought, this is a great idea. Nobody will go for it. It's too good. So, but if I can show them that there's merchandise and they'll make money with merchandise. So I drew this like 10-foot panorama of in 2 sections of all these Jack Kirby monsters and all my favorites. And then little figures called the Helpless Humans. That's always a bonus. And I did it, and it was in my exhibition in Paris in 2008. And then an old friend of mine saw it and bought it, and he just resold it for twice as much as what he paid for it. So I'm happy to see that the value of my work is doubled.
Yeah, that's a wonderful thing. And let me take this opportunity to pose a question back at Dennis. Dennis, was it you that outbid me for that Ernie Bushmiller Sunday that just sold through Heritage Auctions? You can let me know in the comment section. Anyways, another question from Joshua Ranger, who is the UWO archivist, who's been talking to B. Bukowski and R. Gilbertson about the 70s era Augmento comic in the UWO paper. He would like you, Pete, to talk about your part in that and any memories of Monsieur Grunwald at Oshkosh.
Sure. Well, Mark Grunwald was an old pal, and he was a guy. I would go to Oshkosh a lot and sleep on the floor of my cousin's dorm, and we'd hang out and we'd go to figure drawing classes and things. And it turned out that Mark Grunwald was a comics aficionado, and he had visions. He wanted to be a writer, artist, and that kind of thing. He would say, I want to be a poor man's Neil Adams, because Neil Adams was a realistic illustrator doing Superman and Batman and Green Lantern and things like that, and had really changed the drawing ideas about DC Comics of that period. Anyway, he was a good guy, and we hung out, and he was into all kinds of things in theater, radio, dance. But he and my cousin started doing a comic strip called Augmento. And Augmento is Rick Gilbertson, who was another roommate of my cousin's. Well, my cousin and Mark would lay out this, what looked like a Sunday page. But my cousin, had a girlfriend that he was madly in love with. And so I'd go and visit, and they'd rough out what they wanted, and then I would post the strip, but I would leave the faces and the hands for my cousin to finish. Now, the joke is he was showing me some of the drawings recently, and actually in the close-ups and stuff, it looks more like I drew it than my cousin did. But it was fun because, they had a big... they had a thing where Rick Gilbertson actually dressed up in a costume. We took photos like we were making movies. My cousin did make a movie of it, and I played the bad guy and did all my own stunts, jumping from rooftops and stuff. But anyway, Mark did some work at Kitchen Sink Press, because we did an industrial comic book for Alice Chalmers, and we hired him to help color it, him and a couple of his friends. So, they'd come out to Princeton, Wisconsin, and color these pages with acrylics, and we'd have lunch together. And then my brother had gone to New York and was trying to break into acting. And so Mark went out and stayed there and got a job doing a DC Comics magazine, in-house magazine, and then managed to get hired by Marvel, because the people at Marvel saw what he was doing with DC and made him an associate editor, and then he worked his way up to being one of the main guys. I would go there, for instance, he would send me some story plots, and I would design some covers. And I did 3 thing covers, and I went out and we took it in to Marie Severin, who looked at my sketchbooks from life, and then she looked at the drawings I was doing, and she'd say, "What do you want to be a cartoonist for?" And I said, "Well, I like Marvel Comics. I grew up with the characters, and it would be fun to do it." It was a nice reaction for her to look at a particular drawing that I did in Central Park from life and imply I was too good to be a cartoonist. But I didn't get a job then. But in 1980, I went back, and again, Mark set me up so I could work on a Spider-Man 3-in-1, a Thor comic they were badly behind deadline on, and some Marvel pinup pages. So that was fun. I got to work in the bullpen. We played volleyball all the time. We jump in the car with Ralph Macchio and drive up to his house in New Jersey and go swimming because he had a pool. We went to 4th of July. We were, downtown New York with, the world, the sky exploding. It was very dramatic and pretty incredible. So that was a fun summer. And again, I even at one point, because my brother was tired of me working on Spider-Man in his apartment, Mark, whose wife was teaching at a summer camp, said, "Well, you can come and move in my apartment and work on Thor." So that's what I did. And while I was working on Thor, I heard a noise, and I looked through the little, slot in the door, and here are 2 guys sneaking up the stairway, and one of them pulls out a crowbar and starts taking the door off of the apartment down the hall. And I went, "Oh my gosh, a crime." I try to say, "I don't know Mark's address." And I call my brother, "What's Mark's address? I got to find his address. These guys are breaking in and stealing." So I finally get the doggone address, and I call the cops. The cops come up, and a cute, New York policewoman with her .357 Magnum I open the door a little bit and point down. Of course, they can see the door has, rips in it. And she tells me, go lay down on the floor in the bathroom because these bullets go through the wall. So I'm laying on the floor in the bathroom waiting for her shots, but the guys got away, and et cetera, et cetera. But that
Pete,
was
let me take the reins back because I think we have time for one more question. And there's something that two people have asked, which is your advice to young artists or someone who's just beginning to draw comics.
Well, in beginning to draw comics, you have to go back and forth between nowadays you have to understand fine art, and you got to read all the great comics and why they were great, like Terry and the Pirates and Prince Valiant and all the old ones. And then you have to study movies. I mean, there's so many movie quotes in all the great comic books and stuff. I mean, in the old days, a lot of young cartoonists, they had radio, and radio taught you how to write a 30-minute story or a short story. And so, the best way to do is try to do a 7 to 10 page story like a radio program, and even go and get an old Lone Ranger or Green Hornet radio episode and try to illustrate it in a style that is either contemporary or looks old-fashioned. I prefer the old comics myself. I like the old dots. Nowadays, everything is so sophisticated that it looks too much to me like a animated cartoon, or almost like a pixel movie, as opposed to actual moving drawing. So,
who are some of your favorite contemporary cartoonists?
Well, again, contemporary cartoonists. Well, again, I follow everything that. Again, a lot of the old underground people, like Kim Deitch. To me, Kim Deitch is one of the old masters, but he keeps coming out with totally new work. And I since I know him and it's great, I always look on him when I visit New York, and he's showing me what he's working on. He's doing these big graphic novels. So that's pretty good. I mean, there are classics like Art Spiegelman's Mouse that is always incredible to read again. But I can't say I go out and hunt graphic novels or contemporary comics. I'm much more of an old timer.
Okay. Pete, is there anything else you want to talk about? We're coming to the end of our time.
Anything I can say? I'm not sure. All I can do is maybe just hold up a couple other pieces of art that I'm working on to give you an idea, and I'll show you the most complicated one. This is one for a friend. He better be a friend because I've been working on it a long time. This is. See, I draw big. When I started doing Superman covers in 1990, the only way I could draw Superman was just if I did it 5 feet long, scale. That was different from any cartoonist. This is a big scale for doing a comic book cover, and I had to come up with a story premise and then put 20 superhero characters in it. But what you don't realize is that, like anything, you've got to draw endless poses to fit things together, and the thing is, what's good about doing roughs like this, even though they're sort of complete figures, you flip-flop it on the other side to see if it's stronger with the reserved kind of pose. So, here's Superboy and the Kryptonian robot and stuff like that. And, just over and over again. And I'm almost done because I just got a little detail or two. But, and again, here, I draw on both sides of the paper. I don't know anybody else who does. That might make it unique right there. See, here's this side. There's that side. Here's this side. Here's that side. It's a Renaissance thing,
Yeah, you got to use all the parts of the buffalo.
And this is a lot of work for just a cover, but it's part of the creative search to make something unique.
Great. Well, on that note, Pete, Thank you so much for doing this talk, and thank you so much for being an integral part of this exhibition. It's really, truly been one of the delights of working on it, to get to know you and to get to work with you a little bit. And I hope that we can do so in the future.
Yeah, no kidding. It's great. I was happy to be in a part of an exhibition in West Bend in 1978, and it's always great to come back for another show.
All right.
It only
Well,
takes
on that note,
decades, you know.
thanks everybody for being here, and until next time.
All right. Live long and prosper.